Welcome to the guide, Exile. It would appear that I have another build to share with you this league. I figured, what would be better than going super quick, attacking incredibly fast, and throwing hundreds of projectiles? What about a super slow, attack once per second and throw no projectiles type of build? You may think, wow, that's a pretty bad idea. Yeah, it was. My initial approach to this build was to basically take the opposite of my previous Spectral Throw Raider build and leverage some big single hits. I also wanted to take advantage of some new tech, such as the revamped Chieftain Ascendancy, new uniques, volatility, and tattoos. So that initially steered me in the direction of using the flat damage scaling from tattoos with something like Doryani's Fist. Doryani's Fist provides the skill Doryani's Touch, which is a lightning-based slam skill that has an insane added damage effectiveness of 600%. So all of the flat damage we add to the build gets a huge multiplier. On top of this, lightning damage has a very high range, allowing for very large hits to occur, but of course this comes with a lot of variance that can be very painful when attacking slowly. And this sort of brings us to the complications of a slow-hitting, lightning-based build. It can be very unreliable. Now, the footage you're seeing in the background is the current iteration, but I did start this as a chieftain with low attack speeds and many defensive layers to make the most effective time of Fist of War and Tawoha's Forest skill repetition. As chieftain, this also provided me with the means to get 90% maximum elemental resistances with ease, and gearing much easier with Tasalio's applying 50% to fire res as cold and lightning resistances. Unfortunately, the final passive point is kind of wasted on either low percentage explosions that we don't really scale, or some minor defense from totems recouping life to you. But I felt the strength of the other three nodes was worth it for the defense-heavy playstyle I was going for. Offensively, I chose the base of the scaling to be War Cries, as Doryani's Touch is a slam skill, which there is a War Cry that can exert that along with other War Cries for regular attacks. This provides a mean for many multipliers. With that, as a Marauder, I was also able to steal the Warbringer node from Berserker to get another more damage multiplier, along with rage generation for using War Cries. This also allowed me to run Berserk itself, as I had methods for quickly and reliably generating rage. Since I was already in the bottom of the passive tree, I decided to make the hike over to Precise Technique, which provides another 40% multiplier to our damage, as long as our accuracy is more than our maximum life. Unfortunately, accuracy is basically a dead stat other than Precise Technique, as Doryani's Touch has a 100% hit chance regardless of accuracy. But the name of the game was to get as many more multipliers as possible, as there are just so few unarmed scaling options available in the tree. Due to that fact, that meant there had to be a lot of buffs to consistently keep up or worry about in order to get maximal damage. Defensively, I had 90% maximum elemental resistances, near chaos cap resistance, maximum attack block, max spell suppression with lucky, 40% physical damage to convert it to elements, endurance charges, fortify, stun immunity, life leech, 15% life recovery when you Warcry, and complete ailment avoidance. So you'd figure with all these defenses and a fairly decent sheet DPS and path of building ranging around 2 million at the time, I could largely tank hits and just power through some bad RNG with lightning damage, but that wasn't the case. I would generally end up with very middling hits, occasionally with some big hits, and end up dying in a war of attrition or straight up getting barraged by a pack of white skeletons and folding like a lawn chair. The current APOE is just not made for slow, tanky builds, as it seems. So overall, the build felt extremely lackluster, especially with the level of investment that I had put in at this point. But I didn't want to give up, as it's always enjoyable to me to solve problems and improve on what I can. At the time, I was using the new Udala's chest, which restricted my other items from having any life modifiers on them. Initially, this was a great pick as it gave me a bunch of life I was lacking on most of my required uniques, but I knew I had to drop that chest to make some use of better itemization, such as Echoes of Creation helmet that had life on it. I just wasn't sure what the best choice was to make for the chest. Luckily for me, a viewer from my Twitch stream by chance was also doing a Doryani's Fist character that he just posted a short guide on. I'll link his form guide in the description. He ended up taking a different approach with the build and went with a Berserker, a totally different tree, and some interesting itemization. A big issue with Doryani's Fist is that you can only support the skill with the supports in the gloves, so that off the bat, you are restricted with a 5-link. As my viewer explained, he chose to use the Shroud of the Lightless chest to provide himself an effective 6-link by stacking a few Abyss Jewels to gain a bunch of global elemental penetration, a la a lightning penetration gem in the 6th link. The Abyss Jewels are also quite useful for us with the flat added lightning damage, life, and for our case we can stack more accuracy to make use of Precise Technique. I was already using a Darkness Enthroned belt to pump up some of those types of Abyss Jewels, so I just got some more, and that took even more pressure off gearing to get accuracy for Precise Technique on jewelry. After the swap, the build definitely felt better. The damage was getting better, but the attack speed was just too slow still. and due to that, I was still dying in maps as the majority of monsters were able to attack me first. So it was time to just give up on Chieftain, and swap to good old Berserker. Luckily, I was able to swap to Berserker and then reverse steal Tassalios from Chieftain with the Forbidden Flesh and Flame Jewels, providing me the 50% of fire resistance as cold and lightning to keep the same gearing, while also still letting me get 90% maximum fire resistance and then 78 maximum cold and lightning resistances. Sure, this isn't as good as 90% across the board, but it was better than 75%. And I still had a large percentage of physical damage converted to elemental, mainly fire, as well as a bunch of percentage cold and lightning converted to fire due to Dawnbreaker, so my defenses didn't suffer all that much. And let me tell you, swapping to Berserker gave it that extra needed attack speed that really made the build pop off. It felt so much snappier, faster, and comfortable to play. I was able to beat mobs to the punch and take down bosses pretty quickly now, and comfortably run most all content, aside from Ubers. In the end, as most PoE builds come down to, the best defense is just kill the monsters before they even engage, and your defenses are really only there for the few that survive, not the whole pack. So in summary, the build transformed from a Chieftain's Doryani's Fist to a Berserker Doryani's Fist. And through all the iterations, it has become something of a beast. All in all, I really don't know how much the build costs in its current state, but I do find it to be pretty enjoyable to play, even with all the buffs you have to maintain. At the power level the build is currently at, you're generally worried about using Seismic Cry and Berserk while mapping, and then once you hit a hard boss, you pop your other war cries, toss down your totem, and you smack him to death. So with that long-winded introduction and summary of my build developments, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the build. The final choice for Ascendancy was the Berserker. From this Ascendancy, we basically just get damage. Basically how this works is you'll gain rage up until you have 25 total rage, and then once you Warcry again, you will sacrifice rage, thus giving you the 50% more attack damage. So in general, you'll be bouncing around 25 rage, and when you get near stronger monsters, you'll be generating more rage and capping out, and then of course slowly removing it via using more war cries and then bouncing back up. Aspect of Carnage, of course, 40% more damage, who can go wrong with that? And then for the final 2 points, the really only choice is to go for rage generation. Crave the Slaughter does give us some rage generation. Mainly it gives us the plus 10 max rage. We don't really hit fast enough to make rage generation worth it. We're getting it mostly from war cries. But the Rite of Ruin gives us tripled effects of rage, which is really nice because we really want that attack speed. Helps out a lot on the Doryani's fisting. And then since I didn't level this way, I didn't really go in a specific order, but the order that I would probably go in is Warbringer, Aspect of Carnage, Crave the Slaughter, and Rite of Ruin. That way you are getting some utility out of early war cries, and then of course just more damage. And then the final 2 points give you that little bit of speed. Alright, so here's the final passive tree that I settled on. I went through a bunch of different iterations, but I feel like this is probably the strongest one out of all of the ones that I tried. Of course, there could be more min-maxing done, but it all depends on how much more you want to invest in gearing and swapping around tattoos. So looking at it from a broad view, the tree has a lot of pathing, and that is pretty strong this league with tattoos. We do pick up a couple keystones, such as Unwavering Stance, so that we can't be stunned, and Precise Technique, so we can deal 40% more attack damage. As for the general nodes, we're basically picking up Life, Warcry nodes, some Aura nodes, Jewel slots, and then Suppression where we can. So starting with tattoos, we can start over on the left side here. I chose to use a Red Nightmare, which scales block damage from a percentage of your fire resistance in the radius. So I transformed all these strength nodes over here into fire res. And then all of my other strength nodes are generally transformed into attributes because we are lacking dex and int. And then over here, we're using a warrior's tail. So this doubles the effect of all tattoos within the area. Very strong for getting plus maximum fire resistance. So we can get 4 max fire res here. And then on our strength nodes, again, we are just using attributes as we are lacking those. Of course, if your gearing is different, you could drop some of these for other useful tattoos. Dex nodes for us, most important one to get would be Suppression. Int nodes for us, lightning damage is okay, but the attributes are what we're really lacking, and we're getting a lot of flat lightning from all of our other gearing sources. So attributes become a very strong pick here to remove that need on the gear. And then for the other strength nodes where we didn't need attributes, I put in Warcry cooldown recovery rate such that we could have those up more often for survivability and damage. Over on the right side here, as I was mentioning before, any dex node we have, we want it to be suppression. And then we get the Honor Tattoo of the Paw, which gives us melee fortify. And then finally, we have a Tattoo of Blood Drinker for attack damage as leech. And then we have the Loyalty of Udala, which will summon Spirit of Udala when we take a savage hit from a unique enemy. And that spirit gives us a buff where a percentage of our leech will become instant, which for our style of build is very strong, as we are not dealing a lot of fast hits and more slow big hits. So those leech instances are very big, but they take a long time to recover naturally. When they're instant, you're getting a big chunk of life back all at once. Alright, so the first masteries we're going to look at are the Warcry masteries. These are very strong, and these are definitely ones you want to prioritize. And there are a couple of them you could take or swap around with depending on how you want to play. I was swapping between them all the time based on either what I was doing or how I was feeling about the build, but these are kind of the ones I settled on at the final iteration. So the one you want all the time is recover 15% of life when you use a Warcry. This one's really strong because you're generally using about 3 to 4 Warcries, so you're getting back 60% of your life very fast, and it basically acts like an emergency life pot. And then the other Warcry mastery I generally use is the minimum of 10 power. This allows us to always proc whatever effect that Warcry has when we pull the trigger on one. And for things like Enduring Cry, we'll always generate an endurance charge even if no enemies are nearby. Now the other option you could take instead of minimum of 10 power would be the remove all damaging ailments when you Warcry. This is pretty strong for people that are looking to play a little bit more defensive and don't want to have to worry about having a flask up to remove a bleed or a poison. But I found it wasn't really necessary and I didn't find myself dying to those mechanics, so I swapped it back into 10 power. Now the third mastery that I did have for a while was Warcries cannot exert travel skills, though I did end up dropping this for another point. This is because I found when I was mapping I was generally only using Seismic Cry, which will not be exerted on anything but slam skills, so I could use Shield Charge freely with that exert up and not lose it. Now if you have Intimidating Cry and Rallying Cry running, those will be used on your Shield Charge, but generally I'm only hitting those on monsters that I'm standing still hitting, such as bosses. We do get a Reservation Mastery. This is the one to give us an extra maximum elemental resistances if we have a reserved life and mana, which we will. Now the only other mastery we get is the Spell Suppression Mastery. This allows us to almost cap out our spell suppression, and it really evens out that defense layer. Alright, as for jewels, I explained a few of them. We are using the Red Nightmare for the block chance, the Warrior's Tale for the increased effect of tattoos. I'm also using a Storm Shroud because I wanted to get ailment immunity, and this is an easy way to do so by just stacking shock avoidance. I am using a Watcher's Eye that has percentage of physical damage taken as fire as a defensive layer, and then damage penetrates lightning resistance with Wrath. And then for the cluster jewels, I have attack damage while holding shield, and this one comes with Calamitous, Fuel the Fight, and Martial Prowess. There are a couple different options you can take, but mainly you want to be looking for Martial Prowess and Fuel the Fight on the front. This is so that we can have Mana Leech with some extra damage, of course. And then Martial Prowess is damage attack speed, and we also get some global accuracy scaling, helping out with scaling for precise technique. The third notable, I think can be two different ones, Calamitous and one other, but this one's not too bad as it does provide some more chance to shock and a bunch of elemental damage. So the other large cluster jewel is a lightning damage one. This one we're going to try to pick up all of the passives on, and the main two we want to be getting are Overshock and Prismatic Heart. Overshock grants us a bunch of lightning damage and effect of that ailment, and Prismatic Heart is a bunch of elemental damage with all res, which is always helpful. And the third notable on these is a suffix, so it is non-specific to lightning. It'll just be a generic elemental damage one. It can really be any of them. I ended up with Disorienting Display. It has a pretty good increased elemental damage, and unfortunately it has Blind on it, which does nothing for us as we have Unwavering Stance. For the medium cluster jewels, they are both for exerted attacks. One will have Cry Wolf and Lead by Example. Lead by Example gives us our Onslaught as well as some attributes which are nice. And Cry Wolf gives us extra damage with exerted attacks and total power generated by War Cries. And then our second jewel will have Cry Wolf with Mob Mentality. Mob Mentality will give us 25% increased damage while we also get a chance to generate Endurance, Frenzy, or Power charges per power. And then, of course, again, Cry Wolf. Now, with these two Cry Wolves and the base 10 power, we're getting around 14 power every time we War Cry. If there are no enemies, of course, if there are more enemies, you get more. But at a minimum, you're getting 14, so that does bring up your chance here to generate from Mob Mentality. I never found it that consistent, but sometimes you do get the charges you want. And then for the final jewels on these clusters, I put in our Forbidden Flame and Flesh. Again, we're taking Tassalio's Cleansing Water from Chieftain, and that will give us our 50% of fire res applied as cold and lightning resistances. And then for the Abyss jewels, we basically want flat lightning damage, accuracy, and life. Those are the main 3 stats you're looking for. If you find something else on them, that's great. But generally, the prefixes aren't too good for unarmed builds. They basically all require weapons. Alright, for the Pantheon, I chose to use Soul of Arakali. This is pretty good for reducing damage over time effects, and is generally helpful as most of the defenses we have are for blocking hits. And then Soul of Rislatha for the Miner, I chose to use this just to get extra Flask charges, and of course when I was dealing less damage, removing the life regeneration rate of a lot of enemies, such as Essence monsters, was kind of required. But of course, like with most builds, you can choose to use any Pantheon you want that fits your playstyle. So the gem links for this build are pretty sparse, as we do not have many sockets. Starting out with Doryani's Touch, we're using Volatility. This is a new support skill that gives a much wider range on our lightning damage, allowing us to hit real high and not bringing the floor too much lower than it already was, as lightning damage is already a very widespread skill. We're using an Almost Fist of War to get the 60% increased damage with the pairing of 20% reduced attack speed. While this might seem bad, we do overcome that reduced attack speed with Berserker, and the percentage increase is definitely worth it. We then have a Divergent Pulverize support. Similar to the Almost Fist of War, this Divergent version grants 10% less attack speed and 20% more melee area damage. That is a very strong effect on an alternate quality. Of course, we are overcoming a lot of that attack speed negative by using Berserker. And finally, we have Awakened Added Lightning Damage. As stated before, the added damage effectiveness of Doryani's Touch is very big, so this does add a lot of damage to it. When we are fighting serious bosses, I will swap to a concentrated effect. Getting a 2120 version of this would be ideal. I just ended up picking up a 2020. In the helmet, we have Intimidating Cry. This is our most powerful cry, as it not only applies intimidation, but it also doubles the damage of every hit exerted with it. This is something you'll definitely want to be using when you're encountering harder enemies, but as stated before, if you are not using exerted skills, cannot be used by travel skills, then this cry will be used if you shield charge. Then we have Seismic Cry, the main bread and butter of clearing maps. This grants us lots of area of effect, with every exerted attack increasing as they go on. Then we have an Enduring Cry. I have an anomalous version just for the increased War Cry speed. Enduring Cry does not exert any attacks, but it does provide us a nice buff, as well as endurance charges every time we use it, to provide us a little bit more defenses for our physical damage. And then finally we have a Rallying Cry with a Phantasmal variant, as that gives us 10% increased damage on exerted attacks. Now, Rallying Cry is really meant for having a bunch of minions, as well as having a weapon in your hand. We don't really have either. However, I really only use this on bosses when I have a totem or two up, and that will give us a little bit more damage. But the real reason we use it is to get more exerts on our attack for the helmet we are using. In the shield, we have our Cast When Damage Taken. This is just a level 1 Cast When Damage Taken with a Wave of Conviction. The level on this doesn't matter. It's just there to always be applying lightning exposure. And then I just have my Vol Ancestral Warchief placed in here. Doesn't have to be linked. This is what you'll want to use on bosses. In the boots, we have our Shield Charge. Doesn't have to be linked, just in a socket. Then we have Precision, which helps us finish the cap for Precise Technique, as well as linking it with Arrogance so that we are reserving it on life to make use of the Reservation Mastery to get the extra elemental max res. And then finally we have Berserk, just like Shield Charge, placed in a socket. Doesn't need to be linked necessarily. And this is what we want to be using anytime it's up, so that we are doing more damage, attacking faster, moving faster, and taking less damage. And if you're a bit savvy and paying attention to your rage generation while you're mapping, you can press your war cries every time you fall under 25 to keep generating rage and keep your berserk up longer. This can work for quite some time if you are very astute, but most of the time I forget to look and I let it fall off, but I just wait for it to come off cooldown and press it again. Finally, in the chest we have a Purity of Fire. This is level 21. Of course, this is how we're getting all of our max res for fire, as well as a lot of fire resistance to split amongst the rest of the resistances. Then we have a level 21 Wrath. Of course, this is great for the flat added lightning, as well as pairing with the Watcher's Eye we are using. And then Blood and Sand, which we can swap between Sand Stance for more area, and then we can swap to Blood Stance on bosses for more damage. And then finally, I decided to put a Blood Rage in here since we wanted to just go all in on attack speed, and this is nice for mapping as well as on bosses. Usually I just leave this on my secondary skill bar and press it once at the beginning of a map and just go through it, kill everything, don't worry about it. But when I'm doing an invitation or a big boss that it's going to run out on, I'll sometimes toss it on my walk. But that gets annoying when I'm mapping, always casting Blood Rage over and over and hearing it go. But you could always leave it on your walk button if you'd like. It's just a personal choice for me to put it on my secondary bar. Alright, and now to go on to the gear. Alright, so the main piece of gear is the Doryani's Fists. This provides us the Doryani's Touch skill, as well as a bunch of flat lightning damage to unarmed melee hits, some effect of lightning ailments, and chance to shock. Pairing that with our chance to shock from the tree and the skill itself, we are around 80% chance to shock, and in general I am hitting enemies for a full 50% shock, including most all bosses. With this item, I chose to get it with a Corruption of Elemental Weakness, as we don't really have a curse coming from anywhere else due to the tightness on gearing. For the helmet, the best in slot helmet is of course Echoes of Creation, as for each Warcry exerting an attack, we get 15% more damage if you get an upper roll on it. So for most all content, I am doing 3 exerts on an attack with our Warcries, giving us 45% more damage. But it also comes with the downside of taking a percentage of life as physical damage for each exertion on an attack. So for our helmet, we are taking 57% of our life as physical damage for every attack we make. This isn't too noticeable while mapping with our buffs up and getting recovery and just generally using war cries to recover life. Now, if you were to sit in town with no buffs up and just spam the skill, you will definitely notice the hits. But bar none, this is our best in slot helmet. I ended up buying this with an attacks exerted by Seismic Cry deal increased damage. So I chose to use a Dawnbreaker for a shield. This was originally due to the fact on Chieftain I was going for a bunch of conversion into Elemental, which still works for this build, and this shield provides us a lot of defenses. We get a whole bunch of base block on the shield, along with physical damage taken as fire, and then cold and lightning damage taken as fire as well. So this, paired with our 90% maximum fire res, gives us a decent amount of mitigation on top of the block. We also scorch enemies in close range when we block, so for the majority of the time we are applying Scorch. Now the only downside is of course the minus chance to block for every 200 fire damage taken from hits recently, but if we have max block chance, the amount of damage we are actually taking as fire after all the conversions and reductions is pretty low, and the chance to block attack damage really only goes down a percent or two here and there for most mapping, unless you hit an insane monster that's hitting really fast and just going through your block. But I've never really had an issue with this block being taken down any more than a couple percent on average. And then for the boots, we have this godlike pair that I crafted myself. So to craft these boots, I used Deafening Essences of Torment to get the 60% chance to avoid being shocked. I ended up hitting this with a lightning resistance I converted to fire resistance, and of course this was on a fractured base, so the chaos resistance was already on it. And then I chose to lock my prefixes, re-roll with a Veiled Chaos Orb, and ended up hitting the movement speed and tier 1 hybrid life and armor, and then crafted on life. And it resulted in a pretty nice pair of boots that allows us to pair these boots with the ailment avoidance we have in the tree on the life nodes, as well as the shock avoidance from this Abyss Jewel, giving us 100% avoidance of elemental ailments. And then for the Eldritch Implicits, I chose attacks exerted by Seismic Cry deal increased damage. This, of course, can be rolled higher, but I just didn't have the specific Eldritch currency for it and didn't feel like buying a whole bunch. And then, of course, +1 to maximum fire resistance. Again, this could be +2 if you choose to Orb of Conflict this up into the higher tiers. I just chose to leave it where it was, as I ended up getting a corrupted Shroud of the Lightless to push my maximum fire res up there. And then for the enchantment, the best one you can get is the Flat Lightning if you have not killed recently, but a close second is Damage Penetration if you haven't killed recently. I managed to get this on my first lab, and I just said that'll be fine. And then for the armor, we are choosing to use the Shroud of the Lightless as mentioned before. This gives us our penetration for the Abyss Jewels we have affecting us. In total, we have 6 Abyss Jewels giving us 24% elemental penetration, as well as percentage increased life and mana. I got this as a corrupted +2 to socketed aura gems, such that our Purity of Fire would be bumped up to 23, giving us 1 more max res. For the jewelry, we are using a Voice of the Storm amulet. This is incredibly powerful as it gives us lightning damage is lucky with non-critical strikes, and as we have precise technique and no critical strike chance anyways, we're unarmed, this will always apply to our hits. On top of this, we get attributes which we need desperately and increased lightning damage, and I allocated Heart of Thunder as the anoint, as that gives us percentage lightning damage and lightning penetration. For the rings, I crafted this with an Essence of Wrath, and I managed to hit flat lightning T1 with life, chaos res, and I crafted some more chaos and cold res on there. Our other ring I ended up buying, I needed intelligence due to the lack of attributes, and then I also needed fire resistance, and I found this ring luckily with 2 damage mods on it, so that worked out pretty well. Of course, with these 2 rings, you're kind of looking to fill out whatever minor things you're missing, such as resistance, attributes, and then of course getting as many damage multipliers on them as possible. And for the belt, we're using the Darkness Enthroned for the more Abyss Jewels. And again, to reiterate, for the Abyss Jewels, we do want accuracy, flat lightning, and life. And then of course this belt effectively doubles their effect depending on the increased effect you have, which means you want to put your most powerful jewels in here so that you get the most value out of them. And for the flasks, we have a life pot with bleed immunity on it. Then we have a Quicksilver with movement speed and duration, a Quartz Flask to help cap out our spell suppression, and this just has whatever affixes on it that work best for your builds. Since I had most other immunities, getting reduction of curse effect is pretty nice. And then an Amethyst Flask, again, since we're not really scaling evasion or armor, using an Amethyst Flask is good to help cap out our chaos res and reduce incoming chaos damage. And then again, whatever affixes work best for you. And finally, we can use a Vessel of Inktar as we are completely ailment immune. This allows us to use this flask without any downside, giving us a bunch of flat lightning to attacks and a bunch of damage leech. And when we get those instant leech instances, this is a lot of life recovery. This flask also shocks enemies, but we do such big shocks with Doryani's touch that we overwrite the shock from this flask. Alright, and leveling for this build was kind of the same affair as my previous build. I just tossed on these same uniques here pretty much, used them all the way through leveling. As for the leveling skill, I chose Infernal Blow. I mainly used this because it was nice for clearing packs, and I could use it on bosses and do pretty decent damage with no other real investment. Although it does fall off later in the leveling progression because I didn't put any points into swords. But in the leveling tree, I did include that. So once you get to level 63, you can drop the Onigoroshi and go right into Doryani's Fist. But until then, just kind of using whatever skill you think might work best. Maybe it's Smite, maybe it's some other sword skill, or maybe it's using a completely different setup, whatever works for you, to get you to 63 so you can start fisting. So in conclusion, I would definitely really only recommend this build to those of you looking to experience this fisting style of gameplay, both to and from enemies. It certainly isn't a bad build, but there are definitely better builds out there for the investment. And really, it comes down to what kind of playstyle you're looking for. Making builds in Path of Exile is all about experimenting and find out what works, what doesn't, what's not fun, and what is fun. And for me, making this build and getting it to work was what was fun about it. And I do enjoy the massive one-punch slams when they roll just right. So, as always, Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, Exile.